Pregnancy is a natural process, so if it's not happening or if it's not sticking, something is missing. After having a family member go through infertility and experiencing a miscarriage myself, I realized how little support and education women have around infertility. I want to change that. I'm Dr. Jane Levesque. I'm a naturopathic doctor and a natural fertility expert. Tune in every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for insightful case studies, expert interviews, and practical tips on how you can optimize fertility naturally. If you've been struggling with infertility, pregnancy loss, women's health issues, or you just want to be proactive and prepare yourself for the next big chapter in your life, this show is for you. All right, ladies, today I want to talk about estrogen dominance. And I'm careful to say that because it's really, for a lot of women that I'm seeing, as estrogen displacement. And breaking it down, where's this estrogen coming from? How do we test and see what kind of estrogen we have and how we're metabolizing it? And of course, the approach to treat it. We are seeing so many women, and maybe you are one of those women, walking around with heavy periods and PMS and fibroids and endometriosis, adenomyosis, all of these fibrocystic breasts, all of these symptoms that are basically screaming estrogen dominance. But when I go into testing, what I'm actually seeing in my patients is that they are not estrogen dominant, but that estrogen is displaced, meaning it's all displaced in the female reproductive system. And whether that's the breast tissue or the uterus and the ovaries, or even the bowels, for those of you who are struggling with endometriosis that has infiltrated into the bowels. So I want to shed some light on this topic. And sometimes I have a hard time recording podcasts because it's so easy for me to go down rabbit holes. And then I'm like, oh my God, I'm revealed another piece of information. And then, oh, there's another piece of information. I'm not ready to record a podcast about this yet because I'm not done learning. And what I'm realizing is that, well, I'm never really done learning. And I want to share what I know with you today. And then whenever I learn a little bit more information, I will continue to essentially update you, because now with AI and just in general, so much more research coming out, the field, the fertility space, the health space is really, really changing, and it's changing fast. And I think it's changing for the better, but because there is so much information, it's very difficult to know what's what. And so the hope is that I'm going to help you gain some clarity about this one particular topic, which is estrogen. Now, the reason that I say don't say estrogen dominance, and the term that I've been using a lot is estrogen displacement, is because I've seen a lot of women who have been told they have estrogen dominance, and whether they've been told by a naturopathic doctor or that's, another practitioner, or they saw it online and they matched up with their symptoms and they started to do a lot of things to clear estrogen. So things like DIM and calcium deglucarate, and even for some women, it's medication, because they're told if you take this medication and it helps to block your estrogen or helps to get rid of it, then your endometriosis is going to go away. And what's happening is these women are throwing themselves into early menopause. And maybe you are one of those women who is now starting to experience hair loss and hot flashes and zero libido and vaginal dryness and muscle atrophy, and even like bone density decrease, depending, of course, obviously, if you've had that tested or not. But I'm seeing all these women throwing themselves into early menopause because they're clearing estrogen, and there's so much fear that's been created around estrogen. And estrogen is a vital hormone for the female. We need it. And so I want to help you, give you some more clarity around this. But what I have seen is a lot of estrogen displacement. And I'll talk about that, how we want to move that estrogen and see why it's concentrated in certain areas. And so if you're one of those women where you have estrogen dominant type symptoms, but if I look at your testing and I see that your estrogen is actually not high, it's just displaced in only your breast or only in your uterus or in your ovaries or only in your abdomen, it's helping the body process it and move through it so we can have good estrogen levels in the body and not have it displaced in one space. So obviously understanding your testing is going to be really important, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. So then we can provide the appropriate treatment. And something that I've learned from my mentor, Dr. Leah Hedgman. I'm excited. I'm going to have her on the podcast soon. And maybe you're listening to this and she was already on the podcast. But, she talks a lot about how if you hear advice online and you have a condition like endometriosis or PCOS or an autoimmune, any serious quote unquote diagnosis or condition, and you're trying to fix it yourself because you went to the conventional doctor and they told you there's nothing you can do about it.
I think kudos to you for taking that ownership and the responsibility of, I want to fix this and I know that my body can do it. But we're seeing the mistake now. And this is, I tend to see those patients is after years of trying to figure it out on your own, you kind of tend to create a bit of a mess because you don't actually know if you need a certain supplement or what dosage you need or what form you need, because you're doing it based on feel and based on essentially just what you've heard, guessing, as opposed to critical data that allows me to make those decisions. So let's talk about the testing. I'm not sure if you know this. We know that there's more than one estrogen. There's E1, E2, E3, and there's actually E4 as well. So E4 is just produced by the fetal liver. So when you are pregnant, the fetus will produce E4. There is some more research and studies coming out about how it is hanging around in the woman after she gives birth. So more to come on that, but just to kind of give you that, hey, there is this other type that most of us are not aware of. And then we are aware of the E1, E2, and E3. If you're not, you are now. E2 estradiol is the dominant, the strongest estrogen. It is the one that's produced by the ovaries, by the granulosa cells, that is produced as the follicle is growing and maturing, that triggers the ovulation, the LH surge. That is the one we want. The estrogen, the estradiol, when we have good levels of it as a female, and you'll see when you are cycling, and maybe your cycles are irregular now, but you used to have them normal, or maybe you've never had them normal, and that's what I'm seeing in practice as well. But a woman that has good levels of estrogen, and especially around that peak in ovulation, you're going to have great libido. You're going to recover after workouts, and you're going to feel like you can do a lot more. You're going to feel a lot more confident. This is, if you are working out on a regular basis, it is a great time for you to push your intensity. You will recover more. You'll feel greater in the workouts, and you'll actually see, like, it's great for muscle building. It's great for your bones, for your hair, for the elasticity of your skin, your mood. We want estrogen, you guys. Estrogen is really, really important. And that estradiol is the one that we want the most of. And we want it obviously in the right times of the cycle and in proportion to progesterone. And that's a whole other podcast. But in terms of just estradiol, we do need it in proportion with other hormones. And you do want good levels because it tells us that the ovaries are functioning well. Now, the other two types that are the most kind of dominant ones that we know about is the E1 and the E3. So the estriol and estrone. The E1 is kind of moderate to weak. A little bit is produced by the ovaries, but a lot is produced by your adipose tissue. So your fat tissue, and it kind of aromatizes from testosterone into this estrogen. So steroidogenesis pathway, the pathway that we make all our hormones, starts with cholesterol, and then it slowly goes into pregnenolone and then branches out into progesterone and androstenedione and trickles down into DHEA, testosterone, and then estrogen. So estrogen is at like the very bottom of the steroidogenesis chart. And essentially, when we have too much adipose tissue, and I mean, honestly, any amount of adipose tissue, any amount. And now I'm not saying, because there's healthy levels of adipose tissue for the female. So between 18 to 22% is ideal of body fat percentage. When we're starting to go under that, we're going to see issues with hormone production because we don't have enough adipose tissue to make the hormones or enough cholesterol to pull in and make the hormones. And when we're going over 22, 25%, we're now starting to see more inflammation that's associated with that. So the body is very much all about balance. And when we have too much adipose tissue, when it is higher than that 22, 24%, that fat tissue is like, it's not just sitting there, it's producing, making hormones. And E1 is one of those hormones that it makes, which is this weak estrogen that doesn't have the same effect as the estradiol for all the bone, the muscle, the mood, the libido, the reproductive health, but it does raise your levels of estrogen. And so when we're talking about estrogen dominance, is it estrogen dominance or is it estrogen displacement or estrogen imbalance? And we are then seeing it associated with more endometriosis and fibroids and, fibrocystic breasts, all that stuff. The other one is E3. Now, E3, and I'll talk about how I'm testing these in a second, but the estriol, the E3 is the weakest. It is produced a lot by the placenta. So you will see it rise when you are pregnant, But I have seen it in women who have endometriosis or fibroids or any of these kind of estrogen dominant symptoms, they have higher levels of E3 because their liver is actually having a hard time converting between E1, E2, and then going down into the metabolism pathways and getting rid of excess hormone, getting rid of the old hormones and rebuilding new ones. So I have seen that E3 build up. So how I test, let's talk about that. E4, we cannot test right now. There's lots of experimental things going on, but let's watch the space. And like I said, there's another podcast probably coming about this. But E1, E2, and E3, we can test on blood work, and I do. I used to only test E2. I started testing all three because I'll see E2 for a woman who I know has estrogen dominance or estrogen displacement, and her estrogen levels are in perfect range. And I know that they're not perfect because of the symptoms that she's experiencing. So you always have to, like, your practitioner always has to listen to you and your symptoms instead of just running the lab work and saying, well, I'm not seeing your estrogen as high, so you're fine. But I know that this patient is telling me something, and the symptoms that she's experiencing are all showing me that her body is having a hard time metabolizing estrogen or making estrogen in enough forms or the good type of estrogen. So I do test it day 2 to 3 so I can see that base when everything is nice and low. If I have the luxury, I'll test it around ovulation so we can see the peak of estrogen, and then around day 19 to 23, so 7 days post ovulation, so I can kind of see the pattern of estrogen. And ideally, you're also not ever just testing one hormone. You're also looking at progesterone and testosterone and DHEA, and liver enzymes, inflammation, all that jazz. But just for the sake of estrogen, I do like to see it through that cycle. So then I can look at the ratios and I can see the comparison between E2 and E1 and E3. A lot of the times the E3 is not going to be detected unless the woman is pregnant. And honestly, even with endometriosis, with fibroids, I don't tend to see that E3 elevated on the blood work. I'll see it on the Dutch, and I'll show you that I'll talk about that in a second. So I do want to see that ratio, and E1 is higher than E2. It's a huge flag that the ovaries are not actually producing good levels of estradiol. And we have this adipose tissue, essentially, that's producing and aromatizing the testosterone into estrogen that's weak. And so you don't get the benefits, but you kind of get all the negative side effects. And I'm not sure why the body is designed that way, but it's almost like, when you're spiraling downwards, like everything is the inflammation and the blood sugar dysregulation and infections are causing you to gain more weight. And then that weight causes fatigue in the food that you crave. And then the estrogen production. And so like, it's a big spiral down, but the opposite is true. When we start to decrease inflammation and get rid of infections and, optimize nutrient levels, all of the sudden, everything starts to fall into place. So I do like to look at that ratio through the blood work. And then if you are struggling with hormonal imbalances, like I love running the Dutch test. I never just run it on its own because hormones are not the root cause of what's going on. And we'll talk about some root causes in a second. So the Dutch will show me what your hormones are doing and how you're breaking them down, but it's not going to give me the why. It's not going to give me an assessment of your environmental toxic load or your nutrient analysis or even your gut function. So then I could see why the hormones are doing what they're doing. But the Dutch, which stands for Dried Urine Test for Comprehensive Hormones, is really helpful because it helps us understand from an estrogen perspective of how you are metabolizing it. So there's 2-OH, 4-OH, and 16 alpha-OH pathways. 2-OH is the most protective, the best pathway for the body to move down. We want it, obviously we can assess phase 1 and phase 2 and then methylation through that gives us a glimpse of it, but that's the most protective pathway. And that's where most of the estrogen we want to be traveling down versus the 4-OH pathway. You're now going to see more DNA damage, and that's the one that's associated with higher risk of cancer. So I've tested women and I see this red, and in the Dutch, it gives us a red marker and says, hey, this person is pushing down, quote unquote, bad pathway. There's a lot of DNA damage that's being caused because of this pathway being driven. And that pathway is driven because there's already a lot of inflammation and infection, and there's probably some genetic predisposition and nutrient deficiencies. So if we are worried about developing cancers of any kind, and if my patients have had family history of cancers of any kind in terms of reproductive, breast cancer, ovarian, uterine, cervical, that kind of stuff. I want to look at this pathway and I want to make sure this is exactly what we do in preventative medicine is we can see which way is the body breaking down that estrogen, and we can give the body specific nutrients to help support it go in the right pathway. And this is where I'm not going to get super specific into the nutrients and the supplements because I don't want you guys to try this stuff on your own and create a mess. You might need DIM, you might need calcium D-glucarate, you might need some sulforaphane, you might need some COMT, gene support and methylation, and you might need all of it. You might need some inflammation or antioxidants. I don't know, but I don't want you to go, ooh, I have bad estrogen, I should take DIM and calcium D-glucarate, because then what happens is you're clearing not just the bad estrogen, you're also clearing the good estrogen, and that predisposes you to all sorts of things. And, obviously going into early menopause is not something that we want, especially if having children is your goal. And in general, like women, we need to keep the function of our ovaries as long as we can. It is a sign of good vitality and energy and, good aging, instead of shutting them down and saying, oh, I guess now I just don't have a period. We depend on hormones for a lot of things, so we want to keep them around for as long as possible. And obviously our ovaries are the prime source of that sterogenesis, our sex hormones. So 2OH, most protective, 4OH, the worst one. We want, you're going to have some of them going that pathway, but we don't want very much. And then there's the 16 alpha OH, which is also kind of associated. It's very proliferative, and it is associated more with higher inflammation, higher weight, and therefore fibroids, endometriosis, fibrocystic breasts. So 2OH is the pathway that you want to be going down the most. And like I said, when I see the Dutch in comparison with the blood work next to it, and then I look at the symptoms and the symptoms that the woman is presenting to me, then I can piece the protocol together. I do with a Dutch, if ovulation is something you are struggling with or it's confusing, I do like running the Dutch cycle map, which essentially you're peeing on a strip through the entire menstrual cycle, starting on like day 5 or day 7 and until you get your period. So then we can see the hormone fluctuation is, are you ovulating? When are you ovulating? What's happening after ovulation? Is the progesterone rising? Is the estrogen? Because I'll see women who are quote unquote estrogen dominant, and it's not, their estrogen is in great range, but their progesterone is non-existent. And so we're trying to decrease estrogen, where in reality, what we need to do is improve their progesterone production. And that is going to come from ovulation and the health of that egg and that follicle. So then the corpus luteum can go on to produce progesterone in the second half of the cycle. And it's very connected to stress. So not a single hormone works alone. Nothing in the body works alone. It's all interconnected. And that's my job as a practitioner, is to help connect the dots for you so we can understand, what is the body trying to tell us? The body has so much infinite wisdom. It is the smartest machine on this planet, if you want to call it a machine, but it's so smart, and it knows exactly what it's doing. We just might not understand why it's doing what it's doing. And it's our way to reflect and say, if my body's not doing something that I think it should be, then we should be looking at our environment, both physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, so then we can provide the support that it needs, right? If the flower doesn't bloom, don't blame the flower. Check the soil, check the environment. That's the same thing with literally everything in the system. So once you have identified what estrogen issue you have, is it dominance? Is it lack of progesterone? Is it, displacement of that estrogen? Is it you have estrogen, but it's poor quality? Then we can figure out what to do about it. What I will say on the last piece of it is xenoestrogens, because it kind of ties into the environment. We don't actually have a way to test xenoestrogens, and these are like the fake estrogens that are coming from environmental toxins and, the plastics and over antibiotic use, like you name it, and even having a higher body fat. We don't have a way to test that yet, but you can look at someone and say, she has the symptoms of higher estrogen, but her body's not making good estrogen. And so it's this fake estrogen that's mimicking our good estrogen, but of course it doesn't have the same effect. the bad estrogens or even the weak ones don't have the same effect as the E2. We want the estradiol. We want it in good ranges. And most women, because the body's really smart and ovaries are producing this, and there's a feedback loop that's going, the body isn't going to produce too much. And so what I find happens is we have a bunch of this fake estrogen that's mimicking. And so it's kind of shutting down the response from the ovaries because they're like, well, there's enough estrogen. I don't need to. Slash, then there's usually inflammation and nutrient deficiency. So like you don't even have the nutrients that you need or the blood flow that you need to those ovaries to get the follicle to grow and to get those granulosa cells within the oocyte to start producing, within the egg to start producing good levels of estrogen. So we want E2, we don't want the other ones, or we want, very little of the other ones. And we want to understand how your body is breaking it down. So once you have an idea, I'm going to give you 3 really kind of simple things, but they're probably simple is not easy. So the first one is you want to really avoid toxin exposure. And I hear me when I say this, people do not realize how much plastic we are surrounded by, how many things are in our food, what we are putting on our skin. It still blows me away when I go to the airport and I see so many people spraying themselves and smelling it with all the perfumes, drinking out of all the plastic bottles, eating out of all the plastic containers with literally like scorching hot food that's just melting the plastic into your food, or even drinking that hot coffee, which is paper cup that's lined with plastic. Like, we are surrounded by toxins. And so what I'm saying is you might not have control when you're traveling, but at home, create this environment where you know the source of water and where it's coming from, and it is super clean. You know what you are putting into your mouth and where that food is coming from. If it's organic versus non-organic, it makes a huge difference. If it's a local farmer that and they picked those carrots a day before you got them and made a stew with them, that is even if it doesn't have the quote unquote organic label on it, but that farmer and that he doesn't spray his food with anything, that is organic. He just doesn't want to pay the $100,000 a year fee to get the organic label. But talk to your local farmers and understand where the food is coming from. Start a garden and grow some of your own food so you get that idea and that connection back to food. I find it's so, so important. Like, I have kids now and I try to teach them about the soil because that's how I grew up. And so you have so much more appreciation for food, and you have that filter of like, what am I eating? Like, what is in this package? I don't even know what I'm putting into my body, and the food that I'm eating is literally becoming my cells and fueling either the inflammation or the blood sugar dysregulation, or rebuilding my cells and giving me fuel for good hormones. Have that filter. What am I putting into my mouth? Like, what am I actually feeding myself? Because a lot of us are mad at ourselves that the body's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. And it's like, it's working as hard as it can with what you're giving it. You're just not giving it very good stuff. And it's not that you mean to do that. It's just lack of awareness, right? And so I love that you're listening to this podcast, is because you're going to bring awareness to that part of your life. So avoiding toxin exposure is huge, huge, huge. Like, clean up your water. And the second one is clean up your diet. So make sure you know what foods you're eating, and eating unprocessed whole foods. I went to my daughter's school to talk about food to a bunch of second graders. And I asked them, I'm like, where does food come from? And they all said nature, which made me so happy. Instead of, I expected them to say things like grocery store, or, my mom just brings it into the house. So the fact that they had this understanding that food comes from nature. And then I said, does a carrot have a label? And they're like, no, it doesn't have a label. That's silly. You just pull it out of the ground. I'm like, great. 80% of your food shouldn't have a label. And if most of us look at 80% of our food, like literally write it down, you would say that 20% of your food doesn't have a label and 80% of it does. Even if that label is quote unquote good, we still have labels on the foods. And so I'm not talking about like a cauliflower that's wrapped and has a label on it, unless they put something on it. But you know what I mean? Like, if it's vegetable, if it's meat, if it's even certain grains, like, you have to be careful. Like, it just needs to be the grain. There's nothing else in there. So 80% of your food shouldn't have any labels. And if it does, limit the amount of things that are on that label. And then the last thing is moving estrogen. So What I mean by that is if we don't have a lot of excess estrogen, but it's the quote unquote bad kind of estrogen and it's displaced, or even the good kind of estrogen is displaced and it's just all in one area, we really need to create movement to help the body process it. I always say the body needs two things. It needs nutrients and it needs blood flow. So the blood flow needs to go to the area so it can bring the nutrients, and that part of the body can heal. So if you think about something like ovaries, if there's a lot of adhesions, if there's a lot of restriction, that means the blood flow cannot get to the ovary. Or if there's any cysts or endometriomas, right? You can't get blood flow into that ovary. And that's why it's poor ovarian reserve, because those ovaries are not getting blood flow. And that means they can't get nutrients that you are taking in. And so it's working on all of those. It's making sure that you have the right nutrients and the toxins are not depleting those nutrients. But then what are you doing to bring blood flow to the area? And for some of you, you're going to have to do a lot. And the simple things are things like castor oil pack or drinking anti-inflammatory ginger shots. So anything with turmeric and ginger is going to really help to bring movement into the gut, and then obviously into this whole like peritoneal cavity area. Actual movement, so like Pilates is really great, dancing is really great when you can get your hips involved, yoga, squatting, lifting weights, where you're going for walks. We're so stagnant now. We spend so much of our time sitting. So it's really important that we're incorporating movement on a regular basis. And then if you do know you have a lot of adhesions and, kind of fibrous tissue, you might need to get the acupuncture, and there's some specialized visceral practitioners, visceral physiotherapists that can get in there and actually start and show you how to do it, like the massaging that you need to do with castor oil. And I always recommend to my patients, like, take notes, let them show you what they're doing. And then you can do that every day with castor oil and put some red light to really bring some good heat into the area. And then, of course, we can take some supplements, to whether it's things like curcumin or, proteolytic enzymes, to just help break down some of that tissue while we're working on it physically as well. So I think movement is really, really important. And then when it comes to actually fixing, quote unquote, this estrogen dominance or the symptoms that you have, you need testing. You need testing so you can be specific with the supplements that you need. A lot of women do need calcium D-glucarate, but we need to be careful of how much we give them and for how long, and how are we tracking it after, and why was that estrogen off in the first place? Because if it's a higher adipose tissue, then why is the body holding on to that? Is there a histamine reaction that's coming with that? Because estrogen and histamine are really closely related. And usually there's inflammation and immune system response that's activated. I don't want to overwhelm you, but what I want to show you is that the body doesn't do anything without a reason. And a lot of the times we're trying to solve a very complex problem with a very simple solution. Now, don't get me wrong. A lot of steps that I told you is like, it's simple. Move your body, eat clean food, clean up your environment. But to help the body actually restore nutrient levels and get the hormones functioning, getting rid of the infections and getting blood sugars controlled, there's so much more to it. And it's knowing, the right step for the right person at the right time. I say right therapy, right person, right time. That's where the practitioner is going to come in. That's what, myself and my practitioners do, because when you've done the basics, it's not that that's it. I guess my body is broken. You still have to do the basics. The basics is like the entry into the game. So then we can now really start working with the body and understanding how long those imbalances have been there for, what is driving it, how, is there a heavy metal that we need to think about detoxing, because that's going to look very different than someone who has mold versus a bacterial infection. There's so many different layers, and we as humans are messy. We're messy. I'm messy. My husband is messy. All my patients, it's like so being able to work with the body and the current life circumstances is an art. So I hope you guys find this helpful. And my hope is that you stop blaming your estrogen and you start listening to it, because we do need estrogen, and it is very healthy for us women to have it in the right forms and the right types, but we do need help metabolizing it sometimes. And we might need some help understanding what the source of, the quote unquote bad estrogen is. So I will keep you updated because I'm constantly learning in this space. And like I said, I hope this just kind of gives you an idea of, oh, I don't actually know. I didn't know there was these two other types of estrogen or three, and I've never had them tested and I've never looked. And so if you jumped to the supplements before the testing, this is where I encourage you, do some testing first, work with a practitioner, and then like save your money, put your money towards that instead of the supplements, because over time you're going to spend so much more, right? I've seen people spend tens of thousands of dollars on supplements and never done any testing. It's a little bit backwards to me, and my goal is to really help to change that. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you guys next week.